provided nearly 100 pages of documentation that there were not only blacks in both the North and the South who were free before the Constitution was signed, but they also owned property and voted in elections. And there were also major black slaveholders who owned slaves in both the North and the South. Now that kind of changes your picture. Then why would Taney do what he did? Because it turns out that Chief Justice Taney was a major slaveholder and had major property tied up in slaves. The decision that he rendered in that case was purely to serve his own self-interest. Had nothing to do with law, had nothing to do with history, had nothing to do with the Constitution. It was a decision that he created to protect his own investment. And anybody who knows what's going on in terms of the modern law knows that it doesn't do you any good to cite that case because there's too many ways around it. And there must be there must be a dozen cases out there to back that up. Now, the important thing is, if you go through and investigate what Lincoln did during this period of time, you find out that Lincoln seized power unconstitutionally and declared war unconstitutionally because he had no Congress who could make war, and thus began the greatest debacle, life and death struggle in the history of America. More men died in that war than in all the rest of the wars combined, practically. I mean, I think we all know that. But the real rub in the face of everyone during that period of time was Mr. Lincoln went up to Columbia University and he hired a man, professor by the name of Lieber, who wrote what was called the Lieber Instructions, or the Lieber Code, which governs the acts of a president under martial law. But Lincoln never declared martial law. Well, Mr. Lieber, in Article 1, Section 1 of the Lieber Code, states very explicitly that when martial law is declared, the people or the inhabitants of the country over which martial law is declared need not be informed. All right? Well, wait a minute. You mean he imposed martial law and didn't tell anybody? That's exactly what happened. Because from that time on, the courts changed, the electoral process changed. How many of you know that there was no voting in secret until after the war between the states? This gentleman over here is shaking his head. He's already done some research. He knows. What is the significance of voting in secret? Well, your ballot doesn't have any force and effect in law when you vote in secret. Only when you vote in public, as the Congress and the rest of the so-called deliberative bodies in this country, only when you vote in public as a lawful elector, not as a voter, because voters are a class of people whose property's been liened for the good of the ship of the state, to ensure the ship of state, okay? When lawful electors elect someone, they always do it in the open. That's the only way a lawful election can be held. All other forms of elections in secret have no force and effect and no binding effect on the politicians that are elected. All right? Now you stop and think, you mean to tell me that since the war between the states, every president that's been elected has been elected because somebody wanted him elected? Certainly wasn't because the people's vote had any effect in it. Who was electing the president? Well, the Electoral College made it convenient out there, you see. And if you go back and look at the history of the Electoral College in the 10, 15, 20 years after the war between the states, you'll see that there was a lot of controversy in the Electoral College, and several presidents or men who became president played some real fancy games in order to get themselves installed in office. Now, that's not covered too much in the history books and the textbooks. It is covered mentioned usually in footnotes in many of the law books, not the mainstream law books. For example, those published by West Publishing Company. Now, you say, wait a minute, now, then Congress exists only by resolution. Why do they exist at all, if that's the case? Well, because Mr. Lincoln used part of those 75,000 troops he called up by Executive Order number 1, to go out and bring the Congress back into session at gunpoint. Every congressman, every senator, etc., and their principal members of their staffs were brought back to Washington, D.C., and placed into session at gunpoint. And throughout the duration of the war between the states, the entire Congress, the halls of the Senate and the House, were guarded 24 hours a day, and no member left without a military escort or went anyplace. When he went home at night, there was a military escort there, went with him. That's part of what the 75,000 troops were assigned to do, by the way. Now, turns out that by the time Roosevelt came along, and we all know because of Dr. Gene Schroeder's work, which, by the way, was very instrumental in assisting us, anyway, and pointing us in the right direction, we all know what happened in March 1933 with FDR and his executive orders and everything else. And a lot of people who know that the martial law actually came into effect during the war between the states, they say, well, then what was the point of what Roosevelt did? And the answer to that's very simple. Because not all states were declared to be under martial law by A. Lincoln. It had that effect in some northern states, but that was quickly terminated, all right? Very quietly, without any fanfare. But when all these other states came into the Union after the war between the states, their status was kind of up in the air a little bit, because they were lawfully created, but the Congress that supposedly approved the Enabling and Admissions Act was not. So what Mr. Lincoln, what the Congress did, or what the powers that be did, when FDR came to power, they advised him to declare a national emergency, which included all the states, so that all the states would then have one common law administered under the military by which they were ruled. And by the way, people, for those of you who pay attention to the way heraldry of states and the federal government and everything else is displayed, I mean the flags and the symbols of authority and everything else, why is it the United States flag flies over the flag of Texas? Exactly, because it's a conquered state. Now think about that, guys. Texas and every other state in this union is a conquered entity who's incorporated by the force of military law into not a republic, not even a democracy, although theoretically democracies can exist under military dictatorship, or, excuse me, it's not a dictatorship. I keep forgetting. There are certain technical niceties that we need to obey, or think of at least. Whether we verbalize them or not is another matter, but there are certain things that we need to keep in mind, that since the Congress now exists only by resolution, when the Congress passed all these Enabling and Admissions Act, where did they get the authority to do it? Well, the answer to that is found in the fact that since the Commander-in-Chief is the top man in the country, every act of the United States Congress, since they were ordered back into session at bayonet point in 1862, has only been passed, has only been written on the basis of a pre-existing executive order. Thus, when Congress came back into session, Lincoln had a half dozen executive orders already written up and had many, many other acts that he'd done. The Congress passed a flurry of legislation, all of which ratified what Lincoln had already done. Same thing happened in March 1933, wasn't it? Roosevelt made his declaration of a national emergency and had the banking crisis and all these other executive orders. He changed the Trading with the Enemy Act to make us all enemies, you see, belligerents under international law and municipal law and all these kind of good things. And while Congress was out of session, as soon as Congress came back in session, what did Congress do? They ratified them all. usually within almost all, except for one, and I can't remember which one it was, were ratified within 48 hours. And there was a lot of protests at that time in various isolated places that, you know, I don't even get a chance to read the bills and I get passed. You know, a lot of complaints in that regard. The point was is that once FDR had done what he did, he became the last of the unholy trinity, which included not just A. Lincoln, but also Tom Jefferson, who was the first to bring international law into the District of Columbia when he initiated a campaign in Congress to pass and approve the laws of war, which automatically invokes international and municipal law within the District of Columbia when there's a national emergency of some kind. Now the question becomes, how do we know when we're under a national emergency? When the president decides there's one, no one else has anything to say about it. Not the courts, not the Congress, not the Justice Department, not the FBI, nobody. Example, the banking crisis that was created, or excuse me, wasn't created, that was allowed, no, that's not right either, that just happened in 1931 and 32. Now this banking crisis, there's not a whole lot of information about it out there because it kind of smells when you start adding up the numbers. Basically what happened was is the banks in the United States were taking in gold coin, $20 gold pieces, you see, and issuing back for them gold certificates, which at the time nobody minded. Gold was at 21, 22, sometimes as high as 22.10, 22.20 an ounce, etc., but it always dropped back. What the American people didn't know was that the bankers were taking in the gold at $21 to $22 an ounce and then reselling it overseas at $34 an ounce. But what most Americans don't know is the gold never left the country. Not one bar, not one coin left the country. Why? Because it was all in the bank vaults in New York City, and they had a whole series of rather large bank vaults created during that period of time, and they were very, very large, concrete, reinforced steel, and everything else with all kinds of security measures done up on them, and basically they duplicated what already existed at Fort Knox. And then what they did on the floor, they painted a checkerboard on the floor, and each square was a different color. And you'd walk into this vault and you'd see pallets of gold bars sitting on these different colored squares. And any time there was a change in the balance of payment, the little guy'd come in his little forklift and pick up a forklift full of gold bars and go over and move it on another colored square. And that's how they settled the balance of payments. But the gold never left the United States. Well, yeah, but all the gold went to England. We all know that. Well, it didn't. Sorry, but before Lend-Lease, anybody remember what the size of the sale of U.S. arms and material and everything else was to England? Ran into several $billion, and Roosevelt's price for making that sale was that England, through Mr. Churchill, pay in gold. The next time England placed an order for materials and Roosevelt demanded gold, Churchill says, you got it all last time. And thus Lend-Lease was created, in which they lent the materials and everything else to England to continue the war with a lease that began as soon as the war terminated. Now, nothing particularly significant about that, except that the lease demanded payments in gold. Now, you really start thinking about this kind of stuff, and it makes perfect sense that all the gold would be here. Because every time you turn it around, there's a war in Europe, or in Asia, or in Africa, and the governments in South America are constantly rising and falling and rising and falling, and thus the only place where there was a country that had a modicum of safety was the United States. And that's why all the gold came over here. And we have it all now. Most of the major gold in Europe and England came here. Now, what it comes down to, the bottom line is this, that in these military courts, you're dealing with courts that, as I said before, sit in summary court-martial proceedings against civilians. Now, summary court-martials can be kind of bloody unless you know what's going on. What's the very first piece of process that any court, including a military court, must issue before an action can be begun? I didn't say joined, all right? Because there's several steps, at least in common law, before a plaintiff and a defendant, who isn't a defendant until joined. There are several steps in the common law that one must go through, assuming we have lawful courts, before there is a case that can be brought inside the bar. You know what the bar is? It's that little, fence with the swinging gate and everything else that divides the gallery from the main part of the court. All right. Until a case cannot be brought in bar until the plaintiff and defendant are properly joined after going through the intermediate steps in lawful courts. The intermediate steps include, in this order, abatement, demur, joinder, rejoinder, rebutter, and surrebutter. All right? And the object of all that paperwork, flying back and forth between plaintiff and respondent or defendant, is to narrow the issues, get rid of all the extraneous stuff, and bring it down just to the bottom line, and that's the issue we go to court with. That's why common law cases were usually very simple and also very short, seldom lasting more than a week or so at the outside, usually over within a matter of 3 or 4 hours, because both the issues in the case were clearly defined, and thus, when guilt or innocence was determined, the outcome of the case could be clearly and quickly determined. Now, what did I say was the very first piece of process that one issues? Anytime you get paperwork from anybody who looks like they're trying to sue you or take your property, very first one you issue is an abatement, assuming there are errors in the plaintiff's paperwork. You see, the idea of the abatement, all right, is to give the plaintiff a better suit. You file it to correct errors in the plaintiff's process. And if the plaintiff cannot correct those errors, the plaintiff cannot bring a case. But you must file, sir, and if I ever say file an abatement, I want you guys to remind me what I said, okay? Because you never file an abatement in court. You never file a default in court. You always serve them on the parties. All right? Now, having said that, if I say filed anytime, I want to hear it from you, okay? Because I do slip every now and then. I've been spending so much time in bar, I've forgotten how to fight a case out of bar. All right? But the bottom line is, does a military court or a defendant who brings process in a military court have lawful process? What is the law of such courts during peacetime? Well, if you go through the sources, it's international and municipal law. All right? You look at international law, it's got some cute little things in it, you know. As long as there's full disclosure of everything that's going on, why you can't accuse anyone of fraud under international law. And that's why I don't join conspiracy movements, because everything I need to know about what the government has done to us and why they've done it is a matter of public record. It must be that way, or you can bring fraud against anyone and make it stick in the United States government. But under international law, you have things like deceit is legal. You're a belligerent. You're an enemy. I'm the United States government. You're my enemy. I have the right to use deceit in order to deceive you and win any confrontation or engagement that we have between us. That's legal under international law. And any book you pick up, whether it's by Miss Dieter and her book on the laws of war, I can't remember her first name, it's like Phyllis DeLupus Dieter, all right, the laws of war, I remember the title of the book. Every single international law text you pick up, whether introductory or advanced, makes it very clear that deceit is legal. Thus, they don't have to tell you everything in court. They can deceive you in court, and it isn't fraud, because you're expected to know the law. All right? And everything's a matter of public record anyway. Now, we've been running around the Patriot movement for the last, I don't know how many years, accusing every judge in any court you can find, or in any court that you appear, of fraud and misrepresentation and malfeasance and misfeasance and everything else. But those charges are only valid provided he breaks the international law, because that's the law under which he sits. And municipal law explains why virtually every small town in the country and county and state exists as a municipal corporation, and why there's so many municipal courts in all the states. Now, they're called by different names in different states, but they're all forms of municipal court. Especially a traffic court is a municipal court. Okay? It's important to remember these things, because if you're going into a court where it's international law or municipal law, you have to know the rules of process, don't you? You got to know the rules of the court. You got to also know the style manual. And the reason why you have to know these things is because therein lies the key to the effectiveness of a non-statutory abatement. Because under international law, no party to an action can appear in his own name. All right? You can only appear in a fictitious name. And what I'm going to do right now is let you all stand and stretch and say howdy to each other for about 10